In a world of increasing complexity, true power often lies in simplicity. An old man boards a public bus in Mason Creek, taking his usual seat, carrying a weathered military duffel bag. Nothing remarkable, except that his very unremarkability is the result of 15 years of careful crafting, 15 years of hiding in plain sight, watching a corrupt organization grow, waiting for the moment they'd make the mistake he knew would come. Today, that mistake arrives in the form of the Night Reapers, a motorcycle gang serving as muscle for an international arms dealer. They see a frail target, an easy mark to intimidate. They don't see the legendary operative who once brought down entire criminal empires, the man whose mission failure in Dubai saved dozens of innocent lives but forced him into the shadows. They don't see the carefully laid trap that's been 15 years in the making. The old man adjusts his cap, watching the bikers approach through the bus's rain-streaked windows. His fingers, though weathered, haven't forgotten their training. His mind, though appearing lost in the fog of age, remains razor-sharp. He's not just ready for them. He's been waiting for them. They call him the Ghost. And by the time the Night Reapers realize why, it will be far too late. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The late afternoon rain painted Mason Creek in shades of gray, transforming the industrial town into a somber portrait of small-town America in decline. Weathered brick buildings lined the narrow streets, their faded signs telling stories of better days. Steam rose from aging manhole covers, mixing with the falling rain to create a misty veil that shrouded the town in an almost ethereal gloom. At the corner of Maple and 8th Street, beneath a rusted bus shelter with peeling paint and decades of graffiti, stood an elderly man. His weathered hands clutched a worn military duffel bag, each raindrop that fell from the brim of his faded navy, cap marking time like a silent metronome. The man's posture, despite his apparent age, held a subtle rigidity that seemed out of place. A backbone too straight, shoulders too square for someone his age. His eyes, sharp and alert beneath the cap's brim, continuously scanned his surroundings, with practiced efficiency. Through the rain, Mason Creek revealed its character in layers. A diner across the street still advertised best coffee in town in neon that flickered weakly against the gray sky. The hardware store next door had boards across its windows, a for lease sign hanging crookedly in the door. A small group of teenagers huddled under the awning of the corner store, sharing a cigarette and casting furtive glances at passing cars. The number 47 bus appeared through the rain like a ghost, its headlights cutting through the mist. Its hydraulics wheezed as it lowered to the curb, the doors folding open with a tired groan. The old man climbed aboard with deliberate movements, each step measured and careful. Though there was something in his gait that suggested this careful movement was more habit than necessity. "Transfer?" the driver asked, barely looking up from her crossword puzzle. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s, with reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of her nose. A small fan clipped to her dashboard ruffled the pages of her puzzle book. "No, ma'am. One way." His voice was quiet but clear, carrying a hint of authority that seemed at odds with his fragile appearance. He paid his fare with exact change, quarters and dimes laid out with precise movements. The coins clinked against each other like tiny bells as they fell into the fare box. The bus was half full with the usual afternoon crowd, office workers heading home early, students with backpacks full of homework, service workers starting their evening shifts. The old man made his way down the aisle, his movements subtle but precise as the bus lurched forward. He found an empty seat near the middle, positioning himself with a clear view of both exits. The duffel bag settled at his feet, a faded military patch barely visible beneath decades of wear. His hands, though wrinkled, were steady as he adjusted his position. A young mother with a sleeping toddler sat across the aisle, offering a polite smile, which he returned with a slight nod. Behind him, two teenagers shared earbuds, their music faintly audible in the quiet bus. As the bus wound its way through the rain-slicked streets, the old man's mind wandered. The gentle sway of the vehicle, the rhythmic sound of windshield wipers, and the soft patter of rain against glass created an almost hypnotic atmosphere. He watched the town pass by through foggy windows. The old textile mill with its broken windows, the dollar store with its garish signs, the public library that had seen better days. 3 stops later, the relative peace of the afternoon commute shattered. The bus doors opened at the corner of Wilson and 4th, admitting a gust of wet air and 5 men who seemed to fill the entire entrance with their presence. Their leather jackets gleamed with rain, heavy boots leaving muddy tracks on the floor as they swaggered aboard. The leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo curling up his neck, didn't bother paying his fare, shouldering past the driver's weak protests with a dismissive laugh. "Move it, Grandma," he growled at an elderly woman, shoving past her protruding shopping bag. His companions laughed, the sound harsh and grating in the confined space. Their patches identified them as members of the Night Reapers, a local motorcycle gang that had been making headlines in Mason Creek's small newspaper. The atmosphere on the bus changed instantly. Other passengers drew in on themselves, some clutching their belongings closer, others turning to stare fixedly out the windows. The young mother across the aisle pulled her sleeping child closer, turning her body to shield the toddler from view. The old man watched through half-closed eyes as the bikers spread out, claiming their territory. The youngest one, barely out of his teens with a patchy beard and eager eyes, started harassing a group of high school girls near the back. Another, sporting a leather vest decorated with military-style medals he clearly hadn't earned, began kicking the backs of seats as he moved down the aisle. "Hey, look what we got here, boys." The snake-tattooed leader nudged one of his companions, jerking his chin toward the old man. "It's Grandpa out for his afternoon stroll." Scattered laughter rippled through the group. The old man remained still, his eyes now fixed on the rain-streaked window, though something flickered across his features, a brief shadow of memory. In that moment, his mind flashed back. The crack of gunfire, explosions lighting up a night sky, his own voice cutting through the chaos. "Delta Team, maintain formation. Watch your 6. The images faded as quickly as they had come, leaving him in the present moment, where another kind of tension was building. The bus hit a pothole, jolting everyone. The young man with the patchy beard lost his balance, grabbing a handrail to steady himself. His eyes fell on the old man's duffel bag, focusing on the military patch. "Nice bag you got there, Pops," he said, moving closer. His breath smelled of cheap beer and cigarettes. "What's a old-timer like you doing with military gear?" The old man's fingers tightened slightly on his knees, but he remained silent. This seemed to irritate the young biker, who reached out and flicked the military patch on the duffel bag. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man. What's the matter? Can't hear so good anymore?" A few seats ahead, a young woman in business attire half-turned in her seat. She had been watching the situation unfold with growing concern, her hands clutching her laptop bag tightly. "Leave him alone," she called out, her voice trembling slightly despite her brave words. The bikers turned their attention to her momentarily, their grins widening like wolves spotting fresh prey. "Got yourself a girlfriend, Gramps?" The leader laughed, running a hand over his snake tattoo. "Ain't that sweet? Maybe you should stop." The old man's voice cut through the air like a knife, quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of warning. For a moment, the leader seemed taken aback, his cocky grin faltering. The bus lurched to a stop at the next corner, and several passengers hurriedly disembarked, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. The driver's eyes met the old man's, in the rearview mirror briefly before quickly looking away. The remaining passengers sat in tense silence, some discreetly pulling out their phones, sensing the situation was about to escalate. Rain continued to drum against the windows as the bus pulled away from the curb, the sound now seeming ominous rather than soothing. The leader of the bikers moved closer to the old man, planting himself firmly in the aisle. "What did you say? To me? Old-timer?" His voice had dropped to a dangerous growl, hand straying to something in his jacket pocket. The old man finally turned to face him fully. His eyes, sharp and clear, seemed to cut through the biker's bravado. There was something in that gaze that made the younger man hesitate, something cold and hard, like looking into the eyes of a much more dangerous predator. I said you should stop. While you can. Each word was measured, delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from absolute certainty. Something in his tone made the leader hesitate, but only for a moment. His pride wouldn't allow him to back down, not in front of his crew, not from some elderly man on a bus. His hand emerged from his jacket, fingers wrapped around the handle of a switchblade. While I can, he sneered, reaching for the duffel bag, with his free hand. What are you gonna do about it, you washed-up old... The old man's hand shot out, catching the biker's wrist before he could touch the bag. The movement was so quick, so precise, that it took everyone a moment to process what had happened. The biker tried to pull away but found himself locked in an iron grip that belied the old man's apparent frailty. Last warning, the old man said softly, his eyes never leaving the biker's face. Take your friends and sit down quietly, or this gets unpleasant. The leader yanked his hand free, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. He glanced at his companions, who were already moving closer, their expressions darkening. The young one with the patchy beard pulled out his own knife, while another cracked his knuckles menacingly. Oh, it's already unpleasant, old man. The leader snarled, flicking open his switchblade. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. The elderly man closed his eyes briefly, as if in resignation. When he opened them again, something had changed. The fragile veneer of age seemed to fall away, replaced by something harder, something forged in violence and tempered by years of combat. His hands moved to rest quietly in his lap, but there was nothing peaceful about the gesture. It was the stillness of a coiled spring, of a predator about to strike. The bus continued its journey through the rain-slicked streets of Mason Creek, its windows fogging with tension as the situation teetered on the edge of violence. The other passengers held their breath, phones at the ready, watching as 5 angry bikers squared off against one elderly man with a mysterious past and eyes that had seen too much. The young woman who had spoken up earlier reached slowly for her phone, her fingers trembling as she pressed record. The mother with the sleeping child tried to make herself smaller in her seat, one hand protectively covering her toddler's ear. The bus driver's eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, her crossword puzzle long forgotten. Thunder rolled in the distance, and the rain intensified, drumming against the roof of the bus like a war drum. The old man's fingers flexed once, then relaxed, a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible, but one that spoke volumes to anyone who knew what to look for. As the bikers moved to surround him, their boots squeaking on the wet floor, a strange calm seemed to settle over him. Little did they know, they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of appearances forever. The quiet old man with the military duffel bag was about to show them exactly why some wolves choose to dress as sheep, and why it's never wise to mistake patience for weakness. In the confined space of bus number 47, on a rainy afternoon in Mason Creek, a legend was about to be born, whether he wanted it or not. The tension that had been building on bus number 47 finally snapped. The leader of the Night Reapers lunged forward, his switchblade slicing through the air where the old man's shoulder had been just a moment before. But the elderly man was no longer there. With a fluid movement that defied his apparent age, he shifted aside, one hand catching the biker's wrist while the other gripped his attacker's leather jacket. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for the stunned passengers. The old man redirected the biker's momentum, using his own weight and force against him. The leader of the Night Reapers found himself airborne for a brief moment, before crashing into an empty row of seats, his switchblade clattering to the floor. Jesus Christ, someone whispered, and the bus erupted into chaos. The young biker with the patchy beard charged forward, swinging wildly. The old man's response was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. He stepped into the attack, his elbow connecting with the young man's solar plexus. As the biker doubled over, gasping for air, the old man guided him firmly but almost, gently into a seat. "Stay down, son," he said quietly. "This doesn't have to get worse." But the remaining 3 bikers weren't interested in de-escalation. They spread out in the narrow aisle, trying to surround him. The mother with the sleeping toddler scrambled away, moving toward the front of the bus. Other passengers pressed themselves against windows or ducked behind seats. Phone cameras recorded every moment, their small red lights dotting the interior like electronic fireflies. The bus driver, her crossword puzzle forgotten, had pulled over to the curb. Rain drummed against the roof as she reached for her radio, but her eyes remained fixed on the rearview mirror, watching the scene unfold. The old man stood calmly in the center of the aisle, his stance relaxed but alert. Gone was any pretense of frailty. His movements were those of a trained fighter, someone who had spent decades honing his craft in situations far more dangerous than this. Two of the bikers attacked simultaneously. One threw a punch aimed at the old man's head while the other tried to grab his legs. The elderly man's response was a blur of efficient movement. He caught the punch and redirected it into the second attacker, then used the momentum to spin the first biker into a headlock. A precise pressure point manipulation had the man slumping unconscious before he could even cry out. The third biker, seeing his friend drop, hesitated. His hand strayed to his back pocket, and the old man's eyes narrowed. "I wouldn't," he said, softly. "You draw that gun, and this becomes something else entirely." The biker's hand froze. How had the old man known about the concealed weapon? The moment of hesitation cost him. The elderly man closed the distance between them with shocking speed. There was a brief scuffle, a grunt of pain, and the biker found himself face down on the bus floor, his arm twisted behind him at an uncomfortable angle. By now, the leader had recovered his senses and his knife. He rose from the seats where he'd landed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. His snake tattoo seemed to writhe with each labored breath. "Who the hell are you?" He snarled, but there was fear mixing with the anger in his voice now. The old man didn't respond immediately. He was focused on efficiently disarming the biker he held pinned, removing a pistol from the man's waistband and methodically disassembling it. The parts clattered to the floor one by one, scattering under the seats. "Someone you shouldn't have messed with," he finally replied, his voice carrying that same quiet authority it had held earlier. He released the pinned biker, who scrambled away, clutching his twisted arm. The leader looked around at his defeated crew, one unconscious, one gasping for air in a seat, one nursing an injured arm, and one frozen in place, afraid to move. The reality of the situation seemed to finally penetrate his anger. His hand, still gripping the switchblade, trembled slightly. "This isn't over," he threatened, but his voice lacked conviction. "It is," the old man stated simply. "Unless you want me to show these nice people with the cameras exactly how much more unpleasant this can get." As if on cue, several passengers adjusted their phones, making sure to capture every detail. The young woman who had spoken up earlier had moved to a better vantage point, her phone steady as she recorded. There was something in her eyes beyond just curiosity now. A spark of recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. The bus had stopped at a corner, its doors open to the rainy afternoon. The old man gestured toward the exit. "Time for you and your friends to leave." For a moment, it seemed like the leader might resist. His knuckles whitened around the knife handle and his jaw clenched. But then his eyes met the old man's gaze again, and whatever he saw there made him reconsider. He spat on the floor, a final act of defiance, before backing toward the exit. "Get up!" he barked at his companions. "We're out of here!" The conscious members of his crew didn't need to be told twice. They helped their unconscious friend to his feet and half-carried him off the bus. The leader was the last to leave, pausing at the steps to point his knife at the old man. "You're dead, old man. You hear me?" Dead. The elderly man's response was barely audible, but it carried clearly in the hushed bus. "Better men than you have tried." The doors closed with a hydraulic hiss, and the bus pulled away from the curb, leaving the night reapers standing in the rain. Inside, a strange silence descended. Passengers looked at each other, then at the old man, as if trying to reconcile what they had just witnessed with what they had initially assumed about him. He moved slowly now, deliberately returning to his methodical movements, and retrieved his duffel bag from where it had fallen during the scuffle. The military patch was clearly visible now, a special forces insignia, worn but unmistakable. "Are you all right?" the young woman asked, lowering her phone. "I'm Sarah. I've never seen anything like that." The old man adjusted his cap, which had somehow stayed on throughout the entire confrontation. "I'm fine, miss. Thank you for your concern." His voice was polite but distant, making it clear he wasn't interested in conversation. Other passengers began murmuring among themselves, some already replaying the videos they had captured. A few offered words of gratitude or tried to ask questions, but the old man deflected them all with quiet courtesy. The bus driver called back over her shoulder. "Police will want to talk to you, sir. I've called it in." "No need," the old man replied. "I'll be getting off at the next stop." True to his word, when the bus stopped again, he stood up, duffel bag in hand. As he moved toward the exit, passengers parted before him like water. A few tried to touch his shoulder or shake his hand, but he avoided the contact with subtle shifts in his movement. Sarah, the young woman with the phone, watched him intently. There was something in her expression, not just curiosity now, but determination. As the old man stepped off the bus, she quickly gathered her belongings. The elderly man paused on the sidewalk, rain soaking into his worn jacket. He looked up at the gray sky for a moment, as if lost in thought. Behind him, the bus doors began to close, but a hand shot out, holding them open. Sarah stepped out into the rain, her heels clicking on the wet concrete. The old man didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed slightly. "You should stay on the bus, miss." "I have questions," she replied, her voice firm despite the slight tremor in it. "No, you don't," he said quietly. "What you have is a video that you're going to delete." Sarah clutched her phone tighter. "These men, the Night Reapers, they're dangerous. The police should know about this. People should know there's someone who can stand up to them." The old man finally turned to face her. Rain ran down his weathered features as he studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the smartest thing to do is to walk away and forget what you've seen." But Sarah stood her ground, the rain plastering her business suit to her shoulders. "And sometimes," she countered, "the right thing to do is to make sure the truth gets told." A ghost of a smile touched the old man's lips, there and gone so quickly. It might have been a trick of the light. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his figure gradually disappearing into the rainy afternoon. Sarah watched him go, her phone still clutched in her hand, its screen replaying the incredible scene she had captured. The bus pulled away behind her, continuing its route through the wet streets of Mason Creek. But something had changed in those few violent minutes. A legend had been born, captured on a dozen phone cameras, soon to spread through social media and local news. The quiet old man with the military duffel bag had revealed just a fraction of who he was, and in doing so, had set in motion events that would reach far beyond this rainy afternoon in a small industrial town. Sarah looked down at her phone, watching the video one more time. In it, the old man moved with a grace and precision that seemed impossible for his age. Each frame revealed new details: the way he anticipated his opponent's moves, the economy of his own movements, the absolute control he maintained throughout the fight. This wasn't just training. This was expertise born from years of real-world experience. She opened her contacts and dialed a number. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Dad? Remember those stories you used to tell me about the special forces operator you served with? The one they called the Ghost? I think I just met him." As she spoke these words into her phone, somewhere in the rain-soaked streets of Mason Creek, an old man with a military duffel bag was already planning his next move. The Night Reapers wouldn't let this humiliation go unanswered, and he knew better than most how quickly violence could escalate. But for now, he walked through the rain, just another elderly man on his way home, a wolf in sheep's clothing, moving unseen through a world that had forgotten how dangerous the old wolves could be. The neon sign of the Broken Spoke bar flickered, weakly against the evening sky, its red glow reflecting in puddles left by the afternoon rain. Inside, the Night Reapers had gathered in their usual corner, but tonight the atmosphere was different. Gone was their usual boisterous behavior. replaced by a tense silence broken only by the occasional clink of bottles and hushed conversations. The leader, Jake "Snake" Morrison, pressed an ice pack against his swollen jaw, wincing as he scrolled through social media on his phone. Videos of their humiliation were already spreading across local groups. His snake tattoo seemed to writhe with each clench of his jaw as he watched himself being thrown across the bus seats again and again. "This is bad, Snake," muttered Tommy, the young biker with the patchy beard, still holding his ribs where the old man's elbow had connected. "Real bad. We're becoming a joke." Snake slammed his phone down on the sticky bar table. "Shut up, I'm thinking." He took a long pull from his beer, then reached for his phone again, scrolling through his contacts, until he found the number he needed. His finger hovered over it for a moment before he pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before a cold, precise voice answered. "This better be important, Morrison." "Mr. Cross," Snake said, his voice losing its usual swagger. "We've got a situation. That ghost from your past, he's not so ghostly anymore." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Cross spoke again, his voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Describe him." As Snake detailed the encounter on the bus, the bar's regular patrons unconsciously shifted away from the biker's corner. Something in the air had changed. The typical rowdy biker gang atmosphere had been replaced by something darker, more purposeful. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Matthews sat in her small apartment, her laptop casting a blue glow across her face as she researched. The video she'd captured had already garnered thousands of views, and comments were flooding in. Some claimed the old man was a retired Special Forces operator. Others insisted it was staged, but Sarah wasn't interested in the speculation. She was looking for facts. Her father's stories about the ghost had been a constant part of her childhood. A legendary operative who could appear and disappear at will, who could dismantle entire enemy compounds single-handedly. Her father had served with him briefly, though he never knew the man's real name. Now, 20 years later, those stories had come to life on a public bus in Mason Creek. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call. "Dad?" "Sarah." Her father's voice was tense. "I saw the video. You need to delete it. Now." She sat up straighter. "What? Why?" "Dad, this is huge. The Night Reapers have been terrorizing this town for months, and finally someone—" "Listen to me very carefully," he interrupted. "If that's who I think it is, you're dealing with something much bigger than a local biker gang. There are people who have been looking for him for years. Dangerous people. Delete the video. Walk away." Sarah glanced at her screen, where multiple windows displayed her research. "Dad, what aren't you telling me? Who is he really?" Her father sighed heavily. "I can't. Look, just promise me you'll be careful. And if you see him again, stay away." Across town, in a modest house on a quiet street, the old man, known to a select few as John Miller, though that wasn't his real name, stood in his basement. The space was Spartan, with bare concrete walls and utilitarian furnishings. But one wall told a story. Photographs, yellowed with age, showed younger versions of himself with different units, in different war zones. Maps and newspaper clippings filled the spaces between, connected by red string that created a web of relationships and events. He moved to a heavy gun safe in the corner, entering a complex combination. Inside, past the obvious weapons, he pressed a hidden catch to reveal a second compartment. From it, he withdrew a thick file labeled Operation Starburst, Classified. The pages inside were heavily redacted, but certain names stood out. Cross, Martinez, Chen. Names that belonged to people who should have died 15 years ago. His burner phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "The ghost returns. Time to finish what we started." Miller closed his eyes, memories flooding back. A midnight. Raid gone wrong. Civilians who weren't supposed to be there. A choice between completing the mission and saving innocent lives. His team had chosen humanity over orders, but their target, Marcus Cross, had escaped. Now, years later, That decision had come back to haunt him. The basement's silence was broken by a soft footstep upstairs. Miller froze, his senses instantly alert. Another creak, too deliberate to be random. Someone was in his house. Moving silently, he pressed a hidden button under his desk. The wall of photographs slid aside, revealing a narrow escape tunnel, a precaution from years of living in the shadows. But before he could move toward it, his phone buzzed again. This time, there was a photo. Sarah Matthews entering her apartment. Building time-stamped 5 minutes ago. The message below read, "She seems interested in your story. Would be a shame if something happened to her." Miller's expression hardened. He'd spent years hiding, trying to leave the violence of his past behind. But now they'd involved an innocent civilian. The choice was being taken away from him, just like 15 years ago. He moved to another section of the basement, pulling aside a heavy storage cabinet to reveal a hidden arsenal. As he began selecting weapons and equipment with practiced efficiency, his mind wandered back to that fatal night 15 years ago. They'd been tasked with eliminating a weapons trafficking operation run by Marcus Cross, a former CIA operative, who'd gone rogue. The intelligence had been solid, the plan perfect. But when they'd breached the compound, they'd found families there, wives and children of Cross's men, used as human shields. Cross had smiled at them from behind a wall of innocent lives, knowing they couldn't take the shot. In the chaos that followed, he'd escaped, and Miller's team had been branded traitors for failing to complete their mission. Only their commanders' intervention had saved them from court-martial, but the price was high. They had to disappear, become ghosts. Now, as Miller checked his weapons and gathered his gear, he knew the past had finally caught up with him. Cross was back, using the Night Reapers as his pawns, and an innocent woman's life was in danger because she'd tried to do the right thing. Upstairs, the intruder had reached his living room. Miller could hear them moving with professional precision. This wasn't one of the bikers. This was someone trained, someone dangerous. He had seconds to decide: use the escape tunnel and protect his cover, or stay and face what was coming. The decision was made easier by another buzz from his phone. A new message showed Sarah entering her apartment, followed by 2 men in leather jackets. The Night Reapers had already moved against her. Miller touched one of the photographs on his wall, a team picture from happier days. "Sorry, old friends," he whispered. "Looks like retirement's over." He moved to the basement stairs, his footsteps now deliberately heavy. The intruder above would hear him coming, but that was the point. As he ascended, he heard them take position, waiting for him to emerge. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, unaware of the danger approaching. She was focused on her laptop, piecing together fragments of information. Her research had led her to classified mission reports, redacted documents, and whispered rumors of a black ops team that had disappeared 15 years ago. Her phone rang again. Her father. She let it go to voicemail, too engrossed in an article about a failed raid on a weapons trafficking compound. The official report cited equipment failure, but her father had told her a different story years ago. A story about a team that had chosen mercy over mission, humanity over orders. A knock at her door made her look up. Through the peephole, she saw 2 men in leather jackets. "Miss Matthews, we'd like to talk about that video you posted." Back at Miller's house, the scene was set for violence. The intruder above was good, professional, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were hunting an old man, a ghost from the past who'd gone soft in retirement. What they didn't understand was that some ghosts don't rest. Some ghosts carry the weight of their past like armor, and when threatened, they don't disappear. They strike. Miller took a deep breath, centered himself, and prepared to show them exactly why he'd earned his reputation. The peace and quiet of his retirement had been nice, but perhaps it was time for the ghost to remind the world why he'd been feared. In 3 different locations across Mason Creek, a dingy bar, a modest house, and an apartment building, the pieces were moving into place. Cross, emerging from the shadows after 15 years. The Night Reapers, pawns in a game they didn't understand. Sarah, an innocent whose pursuit of truth had put her in danger. And Miller, a ghost forced to become solid once more. The rain had stopped, but the night was just beginning. In the bar, Cross hung up his phone and began issuing orders to his real operatives, professional killers who made the Night Reapers look like schoolyard bullies. In Sarah's apartment building, 2 men picked her lock with practiced ease. And in Miller's house, a trained assassin waited at the top of the basement stairs, weapon ready. The past had finally caught up, and now there would be no more running, no more hiding. The ghost would have to face his old demons, protect an innocent woman, and perhaps finally finish what had been started 15 years ago. As Miller took the first step up his basement stairs, he allowed himself a grim smile. Sometimes the hardest part of being a ghost wasn't disappearing. It was choosing the right moment to reappear. That moment had come, and Mason Creek would never be the same. Miller moved through the darkness of Mason Creek streets with practiced efficiency, a grocery bag in one hand serving as perfect cover for the weapon beneath. The evening air still held the dampness from the afternoon rain, and steam rose from the cooling asphalt. He'd dealt with the assassin in his house, efficiently, quietly, and with a precision that would have impressed his old combat instructors. Now he had another mission, reaching Sarah Matthews before Cross's men did. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an old contact. Cross is mobilized, full tactical team. They're not just cleaning up anymore, they're hunting. A passing car's headlights swept across the street, and Miller seamlessly merged with a group of evening shoppers. Just another elderly man heading home after picking up groceries. The tactical vest beneath his worn jacket and the ceramic plates sewn into his seemingly shabby clothes were invisible to casual observers. 2 blocks ahead, Sarah Matthews was about to learn exactly how deep she'd wandered into dangerous waters. The 2 men in leather jackets had been joined by 2 more, all of them carrying concealed weapons far too professional for common bikers. They'd disabled the building's security cameras and were methodically working their way toward her floor. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, oblivious to the approaching danger, her laptop screen illuminating her face as she dug deeper into the mystery. She'd found something in the redacted files, a pattern that connected a series of seemingly unrelated events from 15 years ago. Weapons shipments that disappeared, corrupt officials who vanished, and always on the periphery, whispers of a ghost. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her apartment. Sarah looked up, suddenly aware of how quiet the building had become. No TV sounds from her neighbors, no usual evening bustle. Just silence, broken only by the soft footsteps approaching her door. The knock, when it came, was professional and authoritative. "Miss Matthews? Building security. We need to talk about a leak in the apartment above you." Sarah's heart began to race. She knew her building's security staff. There were only 2 of them, and neither worked this late. Slowly, she reached for her phone, but before she could grab it, she heard the unmistakable sound of a key in her lock, but she hadn't given anyone a key. The door began to open. 3 blocks away, Miller increased his pace. He'd spotted the surveillance team Cross had positioned around Sarah's building, 2 in a parked car, 1 pretending to smoke by the entrance, another walking a dog that was far too well trained to be a casual pet. Professional work, but Miller had written some of the procedures they were following. His phone vibrated again. Snake Morrison's voice came through in a recorded message. "You humiliated us, old man. Now you get to watch while everything burns." Miller allowed himself a grim smile. The Night Reapers were still playing tough, unaware they were just pawns in Cross's larger game. He remembered Cross's tendency to use local muscle as disposable assets, burning them once they'd served their purpose. The bikers had no idea they were already dead men walking. A police car rolled past, its officers oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. Miller noted its patrol pattern. He'd need to factor response times into his planning. The city's finest would eventually get involved, but by then, this would all be over, one way or another. Sarah's building loomed ahead, its brick facade hiding the deadly game playing out inside. Miller did a final equipment check as he approached. The grocery bag contained flashbangs disguised as canned goods. The jacket concealed a tactical harness, and his trusty combat knife rode in a hidden sheath at his lower back. He hadn't survived this long by walking into ambushes unprepared. Inside her apartment, Sarah had seconds to react. As the door swung open, she grabbed her laptop and sprinted for the bathroom, the only room with a lock and a small window leading to the fire escape. Behind her, she heard men entering her apartment with practiced coordination. "Check the rooms. She's here somewhere. Cross wants her alive. He has questions about that video." Sarah's hands trembled as she fought with the bathroom window's ancient latch. Below, 4 stories of rusted metal fire escape waited, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. She had no way of knowing that at that exact moment, Miller was dealing with the surveillance team outside. The first observer never saw Miller coming. One moment he was watching the building's entrance. The next he was unconscious, carefully propped on the bench to look like any other evening dozer. The dog walker lasted a few seconds longer, just enough time to realize that the elderly man with groceries moved nothing like an elderly man should. In the parked car, 2 more observers noticed their comrade's disappearance. They reached for weapons, but Miller was already gone, a ghost melting into the building's shadows. They exited the vehicle, weapons ready, scanning for a target that had decades of experience in not being seen. The first observer went down silently, pulled into a dark doorway. The second managed to get off a short burst of suppressed fire before Miller's grocery bag caught him in the face, except it wasn't full of groceries anymore. The flashbang hidden inside detonated, and the observer dropped, ears ringing and vision filled with stars. Up in Sarah's apartment, the search team heard the muffled commotion. "Check in," the leader barked into his radio. Static answered. "Team 2, report." More static. In the bathroom, Sarah finally got the window open. The fire escape creaked ominously as she climbed out, her laptop clutched against her chest. She'd found something in those files, something important enough that professionals had been sent to silence her. The bathroom door splintered behind her. Sarah startled, nearly losing her grip on the rusty railing. 4 stories below, the alley waited. In darkness, "Miss Matthews," a cold voice called out. "There's nowhere to go. Let's handle this professionally." Sarah looked down at the drop below, then back at the broken door. In that moment of indecision, she heard something else. Sounds of combat from inside her apartment. The professionals, who'd been so coordinated moments ago, were now shouting in surprise and alarm. Miller had entered through the apartment's balcony, using skills that hadn't dulled with age. The first operator went down before he could turn, a precise strike leaving him unconscious. The second managed to bring his weapon up, but Miller was already inside his guard, redirecting the gun toward the ceiling as they grappled. The team leader, hearing the struggle, turned away from the bathroom. That saved Sarah's life, but cost him his advantage. By the time he turned back, she was already halfway down the fire escape. Miller disposed of his second opponent with brutal efficiency, but the third proved more capable. They crashed through Sarah's living room, trading blows that spoke of extensive close combat training on both sides. Pictures fell from walls, furniture splintered, and blood spattered across Sarah's research notes. The ghost himself, the operator, grunted, blocking a strike that would have ended the fight. "Cross said you'd gotten soft, hiding out here playing retired." Miller didn't waste breath responding. Instead, he drove his knee into his opponent's solar plexus, following up with an elbow strike that ended the conversation permanently. The team leader emerged from the bathroom, weapon raised, just as Miller finished with his last opponent. Their eyes met in a moment of professional recognition. "Jenkins," Miller said quietly. "Still Cross's cleanup man?" "Miller," Jenkins replied, weapon steady. "Still playing hero?" The tension stretched between them. 2 professionals who'd once served together, now on opposite sides of a line drawn in blood 15 years ago. "The girl didn't know anything," Miller said. "You could have left her out of this." Jenkins shrugged. "Cross's orders, no loose ends." His finger tightened on the trigger. Miller moved before the shot rang out, but he wasn't the target. Jenkins's bullet shattered the window behind him, spraying glass onto the fire escape where Sarah was still descending. She screamed as shards rained down, losing her grip on the laptop. It tumbled into the darkness below, taking her discovered secrets with it. But she held onto the railing, survival instinct keeping her from following the computer's fatal plunge. Above, Miller and Jenkins fought with the brutal efficiency of men trained to kill. They crashed through what remained of Sarah's apartment, each seeking the advantage that would end the fight. Miller was older, but experience had taught him to fight smarter, not harder. Jenkins was younger, stronger, but had never faced an opponent with Miller's particular set of skills. The end came suddenly. Jenkins, pressing what he thought was an advantage, overextended. Miller turned the younger man's momentum against him, just as he had with the bikers on the bus. But this time, there was no restraint, no careful control. Jenkins went through the broken window, his surprise visible for a fraction of a second before gravity claimed him. Miller didn't watch him fall. He was already moving to the fire escape, where Sarah clung to the railing, her face pale but determined. "Miss Matthews," he said, reaching down to help her up. "We need to leave, now." Sarah looked at his offered hand, then at the chaos of her apartment visible through the broken window. "They were professionals," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "Not just bikers. Who are you, really?" "Someone who's trying to keep you alive," Miller replied. "But right now, we need to move. Cross's men will have called for backup, and we have about 3 minutes before this place is swarming with cleanup teams." As if to emphasize his point, sirens began to wail in the distance. Below, shadows moved in the alley as more of Cross's men converged on their position. Sarah took his hand, letting him pull her back through the window. "My laptop," she said. "The files I found, gone," Miller cut her off. "But you're not, and that's what matters. What did you find in those files that made Cross send a wet work team?" Before Sarah could answer, automatic weapons fire chattered from the street below. Bullets sparked off the fire escape, turning their exit route into a kill zone. "Questions later," Miller said, pulling her toward the apartment's door. "Right now we run." They emerged into the hallway just as the building's fire alarm began to shriek. Miller nodded in grim approval. Cross's men were thorough, using the alarm to clear civilians from the kill zone. "Stay close," he told Sarah as they moved toward the stairwell. "When I say drop, you drop. When I say run, you run. No questions, no hesitation. Understand?" Sarah nodded, her reporter's instincts warring with her survival instinct. She had questions, dozens of them. But right now, staying alive seemed like the better option. As they descended the stairs, Miller's phone buzzed one final time. The message was simple. "Found you, Ghost. No more running." It was signed with a single letter. C. Miller pocketed the phone, his expression hardening. Cross was right. There would be no more running. But first, he had to get Sarah to safety. Then finally, he could finish what should have ended 15 years ago. The Ghost was done hiding. It was time to hunt. The dimly lit boardroom sat 30 stories above downtown, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Mason Creek's modest skyline. Marcus Cross stood at the window, his reflection ghostly against the dark glass. On a large screen, behind him, the bus video played on loop. His oldest enemy, the ghost who'd haunted him for 15 years, taking apart a group of bikers with surgical precision. "Interesting choice of retirement location," Cross mused, his voice carrying the cultured accent of expensive European schools. "Mason Creek. Population 50,000. No strategic value. No military presence." He turned to face the assembled group of mercenaries and former special operators. The perfect place to disappear. The men around the table shifted uncomfortably. They'd seen the video, watched how the supposedly frail old man had dismantled multiple opponents without breaking a sweat. More importantly, they'd received reports about Jenkins's team, some of their best operators taken apart in minutes. "The girl is still alive," one of them reported. "Miller got her out before the cleanup team arrived." Cross nodded, unsurprised. "Of course he did. That's what he does. Saves people." His tone made it clear this wasn't a compliment. It's what ruined everything 15 years ago. His conscience. He spat the last word like it tasted bitter. He moved to the head of the table, touching a control that changed the screen to satellite imagery of Mason Creek. Miller's protecting her because that's who he is, and that makes her valuable. His finger traced a path across the map. He'll try to get her out of the city. Highway 27 is the obvious route. He looked up at his men. Which is why we won't bother covering it. One of the mercenaries, a scarred veteran named Kovac, leaned forward. Sir? Miller will know it's too obvious. He'll go to ground somewhere in the city instead. Somewhere he's prepared. Cross smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's what I would do. Meanwhile, across town, Miller guided Sarah through a maze of back alleys and service corridors. They'd avoided 3 police checkpoints and 2 of Cross's surveillance teams. Now they crouched in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse, catching their breath. They're hurting us, Miller said quietly, checking his phone. The encrypted messages from his contact painted a clear picture. Cross's men had established a perimeter around the city center, gradually tightening the noose. Sarah hugged herself, shivering in the night air. Her business suit, elegant and the office offered little protection against the cold. Why are they after us? What does Cross want? Miller handed her his jacket, revealing the tactical vest underneath. Cross wants what he's always wanted. Power. 15 years ago, my team was sent to stop him from selling classified weapons technology to the highest bidder. He checked the magazine in his backup weapon. We failed. The mission where you chose to save civilians instead of completing the objective, Sarah said. When Miller looked at her sharply, she added, I found reports before they destroyed my laptop. Heavily redacted, but they mentioned a ghost team that went dark after a failed operation. Miller nodded grimly. Cross had filled the compound with families, wives and children of his men. Human shields. We could have completed the mission, but the cost... He trailed off, remembering that night. We chose to save them. Cross escaped. Our own government disavowed us. And now he's here, Sarah said, understanding dawning. In Mason Creek. Why? Before Miller could answer, his phone buzzed. The message contained a single image. Sarah's father, bound to a chair, blood running from a cut above his eye. The text below read, Time to deal, Ghost. Sarah saw the image over his shoulder and gasped. Dad, but he's in Phoenix, he can't be... He never left town, Miller said quietly. After he saw the video, he knew Cross would come. He stayed close, trying to protect you. He closed his eyes briefly. Just like I should have known Cross would never let me just disappear. A police siren wailed nearby, then faded. Miller checked his watch. We need to move. Cross is watching the highways, expecting us to run. He studied Sarah's face. But that's not what we're going to do, is it? Sarah straightened, her jaw set. No, we're going to save my father. Miller allowed himself a small smile. Cross always did underestimate the strength of loyalty. He checked his weapons one last time. But first, we need to make a stop. Across town, in the Broken Spoke bar, Snake Morrison and his Night Reapers were drinking away their humiliation when the door opened. 4 men in expensive suits entered, led by Kovac, his scarred face scanning the room with professional detachment. Mr. Cross sends his regards, Kovac announced, and an opportunity for redemption. The bikers straightened, their earlier bravado returning. Snake stood, adjusting his leather jacket. About time. What's the job? Kovac's smile never reached his eyes. Simple. You know this city. Its hiding places. You're going to help us flush out the old man and the girl. And then? Snake asked eagerly. And then, Kovac said, you get your revenge. He didn't mention that Cross had already ordered their elimination once the job was done. Some pawns were better motivated if they didn't know they were disposable. Miller led Sarah through a seemingly abandoned warehouse district. The buildings here were skeletal remnants of Mason Creek's industrial past. their windows dark and empty. But Miller moved with purpose, counting doorways until he reached a particular loading dock. "Your father isn't the only one who stayed prepared," he said, pressing a hidden panel. A concealed door slid open, revealing a well-equipped safe room. Weapons lined one wall, surveillance equipment another. A bank of monitors showed feeds from cameras throughout the city. "You've been watching," Sarah realized. "All this time, you were keeping tabs on everything." "Not retirement," Miller corrected her. "Strategic withdrawal. Notice how the warehouse district forms a natural choke point between the financial district and the old industrial zone?" He indicated the map on one screen. "Cross thinks he's hunting us, but this is my city now. I've had 15 years to prepare it." Sarah studied the monitors, her reporter's mind putting pieces together. "The bus route that day, you chose it, deliberately. You knew the Night Reapers would be there." Miller nodded, checking the action on a matte black rifle. "I needed to know if they were just local muscle or something more. When they called Cross," he shrugged. "They answered that question." "But my father," Sarah pressed. "How do we get to him?" Miller pointed to one monitor showing the executive floor of Mason Creek's tallest building, the same boardroom where Cross had stood earlier. "Cross is theatrical. He'll want to finish this where he can watch the city burn." He started selecting additional weapons and equipment. "But first, we need to thin his forces. Make him nervous." He handed Sarah a small tablet. "These cameras cover most of the city. I need you to be my eyes. Guide me through the blind spots." "Can you do that?" Sarah took the tablet, her hand steady now. "Yes, but..." She met his eyes. "Why did you really stay in Mason Creek? The real reason?" Miller was quiet for a moment, checking his equipment. Finally, he said, "Someone had to stand watch. After what happened 15 years ago, we knew Cross would eventually resurface. Each member of my team chose a city, somewhere quiet, unimportant." He gestured at the monitors. "We became ghosts, watching, waiting. Mason Creek became my post. And the others? Your team? Gone dark. But if Cross is here..." Miller's expression hardened. "They'll come. Ghosts looking after their own." Outside, the night was growing darker. On the monitors, they could see Cross's men moving through the streets, tightening their net. The Night Reapers roared through back alleys on their motorcycles, playing their part in Cross's game. Miller checked his weapons one final time. "Cross thinks he's the hunter here. Time to remind him what it feels like to be prey." Sarah studied, the tablet, already memorizing patrol patterns. "Where do we start?" "We start," Miller said, "by writing the ending Cross doesn't expect." He pointed to a monitor showing Sarah's father. "He thinks I'll try to rescue James quietly. Instead..." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "We're going to walk right through his front door." "Why would we do that?" Sarah asked. "Because," Miller said, "Cross has one weakness. He always overthinks everything, expects elaborate plans, hidden agendas. He'll never expect something so direct." He checked his watch. "In exactly 1 hour, the power to downtown will fail. Traffic signals will go dark. Communications will drop." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. "A distraction?" "No," Miller said. "An announcement. 15 years ago, we went dark to survive. Tonight, we're going to use the darkness to hunt." He handed her a tactical vest. "Put this on. The night's about to get interesting." Above the city, Cross received reports of Miller's movements with growing frustration. His men had found 3 more of the ghost's caches, but each discovery felt orchestrated, like breadcrumbs leading them exactly where Miller wanted them to go. "Sir," Kovacs reported, "the Night Reapers are in position, but they're getting nervous. They want to know when..." "They'll know when I tell them," Cross snapped. He turned back to the window, studying his reflection. Somewhere out there, his old enemy was moving through the shadows, preparing to strike. But where? The obvious move would be to rescue James Matthews, but Miller was never obvious. Unless... Cross smiled suddenly. "Pull everyone back to the tower. Every team, every asset. Sir? Kovac looked confused. But our perimeter is exactly what he wants, Cross finished. He's been hurting us, Kovac, making us spread our forces thin. He turned to face his me. Lieutenant? So let's surprise him. One location, maximum security. Let him come to us. And the Night Reapers? Cross waved dismissively. Let them keep playing rat catchers. They've served their purpose. In the safe room, Sarah watched the enemy forces repositioning. They're pulling back, she reported. All of them, falling back to the tower. Miller nodded, unsurprised. Cross finally figured it out. Or thinks he has. He finished checking his equipment. He's right about one thing, I am coming for him, just not for the reasons he thinks. What does that mean? Miller was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. 15 years ago, we made a choice between the mission and saving lives. Cross thinks that made us weak. He looked at Sarah. But he never understood. The mission wasn't just about stopping him. It was about protecting people. Tonight, we finished both. Outside, the city hummed with tension, unaware of the forces gathering in its streets. In 1 hour, that tension would break. The ghost would step out of the shadows, and Mason Creek would witness a reunion 15 years in the making. The hunt was about to begin. The city went dark in stages. First, the traffic lights along Main Street blinked out, causing a cascade of honking horns and squealing brakes. Then the street lights failed, sector by sector, like dominoes falling in the night. Finally, the towering office buildings went dark, their windows becoming black mirrors reflecting the chaos below. From his boardroom 30 stories up, Cross watched it happen with growing anticipation. Emergency generators kicked in, bathing the executive floor in harsh fluorescent light. James Matthews sat bound to a chair near the window, dried blood caking the side of his face. Impressive, Cross said, checking his watch. Right on schedule. He turned to Kovac. Status? All assets in position. Triple coverage on every access point. The Night Reapers are still patrolling the perimeter, but... Kovac hesitated. But... They're getting suspicious, Cross finished. Good. Paranoid men make excellent early warning systems. He moved to stand before James. Your old friend always did have a flair for the dramatic, didn't he? James looked up, his military bearing, evident even in captivity. You never understood him, Marcus. Any of them. That's why you failed. Cross's hand shot out, gripping James's jaw. Failed? I built an empire while they played hide-and-seek in small towns. He released his grip with a sneer. Your ghost has been haunting the shadows for 15 years. Tonight, we'll see how well he performs in the spotlight. In the stairwell of the tower's parking structure, Miller and Sarah moved silently through the darkness. The power outage had disabled the electronic locks, but Cross's men had quickly established defensive positions at key points. 2 men ahead, Sarah whispered, checking the tablet showing feeds from Miller's pre-positioned cameras. They're nervous. The blackout has them jumping at shadows. Miller nodded, withdrawing a small canister from his vest. Shadows are about to become the least of their concerns. He rolled the canister around the corner. A soft hiss was followed by cursing and the sound of bodies hitting the floor. Non-lethal? Sarah asked as they stepped past the unconscious guards. When possible, Miller confirmed. Cross's men are professionals following orders. The real target is upstairs. They reached the parking level's security office. Inside, Miller accessed a hidden panel beneath a desk, revealing a cache of equipment. Your father helped set these up, he explained, selecting items with practiced efficiency. After the bus incident, he knew Cross might come. We prepared. All those years, Sarah said, watching him work. You two stayed in contact? Miller paused. Someone had to watch his back. After what happened in Dubai. He shook his head. Cross holds grudges. James knew too much. A burst of static from a guard's radio made them both freeze. Level 3, check in. Level 3, respond. They're getting suspicious, Sarah warned, checking the tablet. 2 teams converging on our position. Miller finished his work at the panel. Good, right on schedule. He handed Sarah an earpiece. Change of plans. You're not coming up with me. What? No, I need to help save my father. You will. Miller cut her off. From here. He indicated the security monitors. I've rerouted building security through this station. You'll be my eyes and ears. He held up a hand to stop her protest. Cross expects me to bring you. It's what he would do. Use you as leverage. We're going to show him exactly how wrong he is about everything. Above them, Cross's men were discovering that the darkness held more than shadows. Strategic points throughout the building had been rigged with Miller's preparations. Sensors triggered gas canisters, flashbangs detonated at key moments, and entire sections of the building became impossible to navigate. In the boardroom, Cross watched his security feeds turn to static one by one. He's using the building against us, he muttered. Kovac, status of the upper floors? Teams 4 through 6 not responding, Kovac reported tensely. 7 and 8 report heavy resistance, but, he frowned. Sir, the patterns don't make sense. It's like we're fighting ghosts on multiple floors. Cross smiled thinly. Because that's exactly what's happening. He moved to James, pressing a gun to his temple. Your friend always did think 3 moves ahead. But so did I. He keyed his radio. All units fall back to the executive floor, and someone find that girl. In the security office, Sarah watched Miller's progress through the building. He moved like a shadow, each action precise and calculated. Cross's men were professionals, but they were fighting an enemy who had turned the entire building into a weapon. 3rd team approaching from the east stairwell, she reported through her earpiece. They're using thermal imaging. Good, Miller's voice came back, calm as ever. Time to show them why that's a mistake. On her monitors, Sarah watched, as Miller triggered another of his preparations. The building's fire suppression system activated in strategic sections, filling corridors with obscuring mist. The thermal imaging equipment became worse than useless, blinding Cross's men with false signatures. Sir, Kovac burst into the boardroom. We found her! The girl! She's in the parking structure security office. But Miller, he's on multiple floors. The patterns, it's impossible. Cross laughed suddenly, the sound harsh in the tense room. Oh, well played. He turned to James. Your friend's been busy. Those caches we found weren't just supplies, were they? They were rehearsals. He's been practicing this, planning every move. James said nothing, but a slight smile touched his lips. Kovac, Cross barked. Take a team and get the girl. She's the key to all of this. He turned back to James. Miller's good, I'll give him that. But he has one weakness. He cares too much. He won't sacrifice her, just like he wouldn't sacrifice those families 15 years ago. But Kovac didn't move. His hand went to his earpiece, face paling as he listened to an incoming report. Sir, the Night Reapers, they're all dead. Cross spun around. What? Professional hits. Long range. They never saw it coming. Kovac swallowed hard. Sir, I don't think Miller's alone. In the security office, Sarah's tablet lit up with new signals. Multiple contacts outside the building, she reported. They're taking up positions. Miller's voice came back, touched with something that might have been satisfaction. Right on time. The thing about ghosts, Sarah, they tend to haunt in groups. Cross got the report moments later. His snipers, positioned on neighboring buildings, were being systematically eliminated. Precision shots from multiple angles, professional work that spoke of extensive military training. The whole team, he whispered. They all came. For the first time, a note of uncertainty crept into his voice. He turned to the windows, suddenly aware of how exposed the boardroom was. Kovac! Get teams to the roof. Lock down every... The windows exploded inward as synchronized breaching charges detonated across the building's facade. Cross dove for cover, as repelling lines appeared through the smoke. Dark figures descended, moving with military precision, but they were just another diversion. While Cross and his men focused on the windows, Miller emerged from a hidden maintenance shaft in the Kate boardroom's floor, a path that hadn't appeared on any building plans. "Hello, Marcus," he said quietly, weapon trained on his old enemy. "It's been a while." Cross rolled to his feet, keeping his gun pressed to James's head. "Always the hero," he sneered, "coming to save your friend, just like Dubai." "You still don't understand," Miller replied. "This was never about saving anyone. It's about finishing the mission." He nodded toward the windows, where more dark figures were appearing. "All of us, the whole team. We've been waiting 15 years for you to surface." Cross's eyes darted around the room as Miller's team, the ghosts he'd thought long gone, emerged from the smoke. Each one was a veteran operative he'd underestimated 15 years ago. Each one had spent the intervening years preparing for this moment. "It's over, Marcus," Miller continued. "The weapon plans you stole, the technology you've been selling. We found it all. Sarah's research was the final piece. That's why you panicked when she started digging." "The girl!" Cross spat. "Where is she? This isn't over while I have leverage." Miller smiled slightly. "Look again, Marcus. Look at how many angles you're covered from. Count the team. Someone's missing." Cross's eyes widened as he realized. While he'd focused on Miller, on the ghosts rappelling in. He'd forgotten about the one person he'd dismissed as just a reporter. Sarah's voice came from behind him, cold and steady. "Drop the gun, Cross. I have the shot." She stood in a doorway he'd thought securely locked, weapon trained on his head. Her stance was perfect, military precise. "You taught her well," Miller said to James. "Dubai wasn't a complete waste after all." Cross looked from face to face, seeing no weakness, no hesitation. His empire was crumbling, his men were neutralized, and the ghosts he'd thought he was hunting had turned out to be the hunters all along. "It's fitting," James spoke up, his voice rough. "You never understood what made them special, Marcus. It wasn't their skills or their training. It was their humanity. The very thing you saw as weakness was their greatest strength." "The families," Miller added. "The ones you used as shields. Did you ever wonder what happened to them after we evacuated them?" He gestured to his team. "They became our eyes and ears, our network. For 15 years they helped us track you, gathering intel, waiting for the moment you'd surface." Cross's gun hand trembled. "I still have the trigger," he said desperately. "One press, and the weapons cache under the city is already neutralized," Sarah cut him off. "Did you think my laptop actually fell during the fight? The data was never the target. While everyone focused on the chase, a team was dealing with your cache." Miller took a step forward. "Like I said, Marcus, it's over. The only question is whether you surrender, or we do this the hard way." For a moment, the only sound was the distant wail of sirens as the city's emergency services dealt with the blackout. Cross looked around one last time, seeking an escape route, a weakness, anything. But he was surrounded by ghosts who had spent 15 years preparing for this moment. His gun clattered to the floor. As Miller's team moved to secure him, Sarah kept her weapon trained steady. She might have started this journey as a reporter chasing a story, but she was ending it as something else. The daughter of one warrior, trained by another, helping to close a chapter that had begun before she'd even known the players involved. "Sarah," Miller called softly, "check on your father." She moved to James, quickly cutting his bonds while maintaining awareness of her surroundings, just as both men had taught her. "Dad," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't know. All these years." James pulled her into a one-armed hug. "You did good, kiddo. Better than good. You helped finish something we've been working toward for a long time." Around them, Miller's team secured the scene with professional efficiency. Cross sat in the same chair where James had been bound, his empire crumbling around him, while the ghosts he'd hunted moved through the smoke-filled room like the spirits they'd been named for. The city was still dark below, but dawn wasn't far off. When the sun rose, Mason Creek would wake to find itself changed. The night reapers were gone, Cross's syndicate was dismantled, and the ghosts could finally rest. Miller moved to the window, looking out at the city he'd protected for 15 years. "Time to go," he said quietly. "Police will be here soon. Best if we're gone before the questions start." Sarah looked up from tending her father's wounds. "What happens now?" "Now?" Miller smiled slightly. "Now we go back to being ghosts. There are other cities, other threats." He turned to face her. "Unless you'd like to learn more about what we do?" Sarah met his gaze, understanding the offer for what it was, a chance to be part of something bigger, to help protect people who would never know they were in danger. She looked at her father, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Where do we start?" she asked. The lights of Mason Creek began to flicker back, to life. But by the time power was fully restored, the ghosts were gone, leaving behind only questions, whispered legends, and a city that would never quite look at its quiet elderly residents the same way again. Dawn broke over Mason Creek, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. The city was still reeling from the night's events, the mysterious blackout, the gunfire downtown, the dead bikers found scattered across the industrial district. Police cordoned off Cross's tower, their lights flashing against the broken windows 30 stories up, while FBI agents began arriving in unmarked vehicles. In a safe house on the outskirts of town, Miller stood before a wall of surveillance monitors, watching the investigation unfold. The basement room hummed with activity as his team, the ghosts who'd come when called, processed intelligence and prepared for their next move. "Cross is talking," reported Wilson, a lean operator whose specialty was electronic warfare. He'd spent the last 15 years posing as a high school computer teacher in Idaho. His organization was bigger than we thought. Cells in 12 countries, weapons caches in 6 major cities. Miller nodded, unsurprised. "And the prototype?" "Secured," Sarah answered, entering the room with fresh coffee. The events of the past 24 hours had changed her. There was a new confidence in her stride, a warrior's awareness in her movements. Team 3 found it exactly where the intel said it would be. They're preparing it for transport now. The prototype, the real reason everything had happened. 15 years ago, Cross hadn't just been selling weapons. He'd stolen plans for something far more dangerous, a device capable of hijacking military, drone networks, turning automated defense systems against their own forces. The technology had been theoretical then, but Cross had spent the intervening years making it reality. "Your research," Miller said to Sarah. "How did you first connect?" "The dots?" Sarah set down the coffee mugs, pulling up files on a nearby laptop. "It started with the bus video, actually. Something about your fighting style seemed familiar. Dad used to show me training videos when I was younger, classified stuff from his special operations days. I recognized some of the movements. She brought up a series of redacted documents. Once I started digging, patterns emerged. Every few years, there would be reports of incidents in small towns across the country. A human trafficking ring mysteriously dismantled in Montana. A corrupt police department exposed in Oregon. A domestic terrorist cell stopped in Texas. Different cities, different threats, but the same signature. Precision operations with no traces left behind. "Ghosts," James Matthews said from the doorway. His face was bandaged now, but his eyes were clear. "Doing what they do best, protecting people from threats they never knew existed." Miller turned to his old friend. "How's the head?" "I've had worse," James shrugged. "Remember Kandahar?" "You two still haven't told me about Kandahar," Sarah interjected. "And we never will," both men replied simultaneously, sharing a brief smile. The moment was interrupted by Carson, the team's demolitions expert, who'd spent his years of hiding working as a librarian in Minnesota. "Problem," he announced, bringing up new satellite imagery. Cross wasn't the only one who surfaced. Look who just landed at Mason Creek Airport. The image showed a private jet with unmarked wings. 3 black SUVs met it on the tarmac, and even from the grainy overhead view, the passenger's military bearing was obvious. "Shadow unit," Miller said grimly. They're here to clean up loose ends. Sarah looked between the men, noting their tense expressions. Shadow Unit? Government Deniable Operations Team, James explained. They handle situations that officially never happened. 15 years ago, they were sent to eliminate our team after the Dubai mission failed. We've been watching them ever since. And now they're here to make sure Cross doesn't talk, Miller added. To bury everything. The prototype, the weapons deals, the civilian casualties. All of it. Wilson spoke up from his computer station. Cross is being held at the federal building downtown. Standard procedure would have him transferred to a secure facility within 24 hours. They'll hit the convoy, Carson predicted. Clean, professional, no survivors. Cross dies in a tragic accident, and any evidence dies with him. Miller studied the monitors, his mind working through scenarios. How long until the transfer? 6 hours, Wilson reported. Shadow Unit's moving fast. They've already placed assets along the likely transport routes. Sarah stepped closer to the main screen, her reporter's instincts merging with her new tactical awareness. We can't let them bury this. Those families from Dubai, the ones you saved, they deserve justice. The world needs to know what really happened. Agreed, Miller said. But Shadow Unit isn't like Cross's men. They're government-trained, highly skilled, with unlimited resources. If we oppose them directly... Then we don't oppose them directly, James interrupted. We do what? Ghosts do best. We change the game. Miller looked at his old friend, seeing the spark of an idea. What are you thinking? Shadow Unit expects a convoy, a simple ambush. So we give them exactly what they expect, while the real operation happens somewhere else entirely. The room grew quiet as understanding spread. Carson grinned first. A ghost game. Make them chase shadows while we move the real pieces. Wilson was already typing. I can hack the federal building systems, plant false transfer orders, make it look like they're moving Cross at dawn tomorrow instead of today. While we move him ourselves, Sarah finished, catching on. But we'll need help. Someone with official authority who can't be linked to any of us? James smiled. I might know someone. Remember Agent Rivera, Miller, from the Stuttgart operation? Miller nodded slowly. She was one of the few who believed our story about Dubai. Last I heard, she was running the FBI's organized crime task force in Chicago. She's here, James revealed. Arrived an hour ago to take charge of Cross's case. She's one of the few federal agents who knows the truth about what happened 15 years ago. The pieces were falling into place. Miller turned to his team, the ghosts who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. Carson, we'll need distractions, lots of them. Make Shadow Unit chase their own tails across the city. With pleasure, the demolitions expert replied. I've got some new toys I've been wanting to test. Wilson, coordinate with Rivera. Get her everything we have on Cross's operation. All of it. Make sure there are multiple secure copies in case something happens to the originals. The computer expert nodded, fingers already flying across his keyboard. Sarah, Miller continued, you're our public face. Your story about the bus incident gave us the opening we needed. Now we need you to tell the rest of it. The real story. The families, Sarah said, understanding. The ones you saved in Dubai. There are proof that everything Cross and Shadow Unit tried to bury actually happened. Exactly. They've spent 15 years in hiding, protected by our network. It's time for them to step into the light. James put a hand on his daughter's shoulder. It's dangerous. Once you publish this story, there's no going back. Shadow Unit. And others like them will come after you. Sarah stood straighter. Let them come. Some stories need to be told no matter the cost. Miller allowed himself a small smile. The daughter was as stubborn as her father. Wilson, get Sarah everything we have. Documents, photographs, testimonies, especially the evidence about the prototype and its intended purpose. What about Cross? Carson asked. Shadow Unit won't stop until he's dead. They can't risk him talking. That's where I come in, Miller said. While they're chasing our decoys, I'll get Cross to Rivera personally. But first, he turned to the main screen, studying the satellite imagery of Shadow Unit's arrival. First, we need to remind them why they never caught us 15 years ago. The next few hours were a blur of precise activity. Carson disappeared into the city with his toys, setting up an elaborate series of diversions. Wilson coordinated with Rivera through secure channels, preparing for the real transfer. Sarah began organizing 15 years of evidence into a coherent narrative, her journalist skills combining with her new understanding of tactical operations. As evening approached, Miller stood on the safe house roof, watching the city prepare for another night of uncertainty. Police helicopters circled downtown, their searchlights probing the growing darkness. Shadow Unit's vehicles moved through the streets below, their operators unaware they were being watched by the very ghosts they'd hunted for so long. Sarah found him there, a tablet computer in her hands. "First draft is ready. Want to see it?" Miller took the tablet, reading the opening paragraphs. 15 years ago, in a compound outside Dubai, a special operations team made a choice between following orders and saving innocent lives. Their decision that night set in motion a chain of events that would span continents, create an underground network of protectors, and finally culminate in a small industrial town called Mason Creek. This is the story of the ghosts, the men and women who chose to disappear so they could continue fighting battles most of us never knew existed. It's a story about sacrifice, about justice, and about the true meaning of strength. But most of all, it's a story about hope, about how sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones we never see. Miller handed the tablet back. "It's good, but you'll need to be ready for what comes next. Once this goes public, a lot of powerful people will want to silence us." Sarah's expression was determined. "Let them try. The world needs to know that there are still people willing to stand up for what's right no matter the cost. That sometimes the real heroes are the quiet ones, the ones who ask for no recognition, who fight battles in the shadows so others can live in the light." Below them, Carson's first diversion detonated, a series of perfectly timed explosions that sent Shadow Unit's vehicles racing across the city. The game was beginning. Miller checked his watch. "Time to move. You ready to become a ghost?" Sarah smiled, and in that moment, she was every inch her father's daughter. "I was born ready. Let's go change the world." As they descended into the safe house to make final preparations, Miller reflected on how far they'd come. From that night in Dubai to this moment in Mason Creek, it had been a long journey. But finally, after 15 years of waiting, watching, and preparing, the ghosts were ready to step into the light. Not to surrender, but to show the world that sometimes the greatest victories are won by those who fight from the shadows. The night was just beginning, and there were still battles to be fought. But for the first time in 15 years, Miller felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. Hope that justice would finally be served, that truth would finally be told, and that the sacrifices of so many would not have been in vain. Shadow Unit was about to learn what Cross had discovered too late, that some ghosts don't haunt places or people. They haunt injustice itself, appearing whenever and wherever they're needed most. And on this night in Mason Creek, the ghosts were rising once more. Night fell on Mason Creek for what would be the last time in this story. The city pulsed with nervous energy, helicopters circling overhead, police blockades at major intersections, and the ever-present black SUVs of Shadow Unit prowling the streets like hungry predators. Lightning flickered in the distance, promising another storm. In the federal building's underground parking garage, Miller watched Shadow Unit's observation team through his scope. They were good, he had to admit. Professional, patient. Their positions covered every apparent exit, and their communications discipline was perfect. They were exactly where he'd expect them to be, which was precisely the problem. "Control. This is Ghost 1, he whispered into his comm. "Shadow Team is committed to the parking structure. Moving to Phase 2. Sarah's voice came back clearly from her position in their mobile command center, 3 blocks away. "Confirmed, Ghost 1. Carson's diversions are in place. Wilson reports Shadow Unit's command frequency is compromised. Agent Rivera is standing by." Above them, the first rumble of thunder rolled across the city. Right on schedule, Carson's distractions began. A series of explosions lit up the industrial district, followed by alarms at 3 different banks. Police channels erupted with reports of suspicious devices found at key intersections. Shadow Unit's response was immediate and predictable. Half their observation team peeled away from the garage, responding to what they thought was a preemptive attack on their ambush positions. "They're splitting up," Sarah reported, "just like you said they would." Miller allowed himself a small smile. Professionals are often the easiest to predict. They follow procedures, stick to protocols. Makes them dangerous, but also makes them vulnerable. He switched channels. "Carson, how's our exit route?" "Ready and waiting," the demolitions expert replied. "They'll never see it coming." In the command center, Sarah watched multiple screens showing feeds from across the city. Wilson had hacked into everything: traffic cameras, security systems, even Shadow Unit's own surveillance drones. Beside her, James coordinated with Agent Rivera, ensuring their official cover story would hold up under scrutiny. "Shadow Unit's command center is deploying additional teams," Wilson reported. "They're buying the bank threats as a legitimate attempt to free Cross." "Of course they are," James said, "because that's exactly what they do in our position. Hit multiple targets, divide the response teams, then strike at the weakest point." He checked his watch. "Time to move. Sarah?" She nodded, hands moving across her keyboard. With a few keystrokes, she published the story they'd prepared, not to just one outlet, but to hundreds simultaneously. News sites, social media platforms, encrypted forums. The truth about Dubai, about Cross's prototype, about 15 years of hidden battles and silent heroes, all of it flooding the internet in a tidal wave of information. "Stories live," she announced. "No going back now." In the garage, Miller's earpiece crackled. "Ghost 1, be advised. Shadow Unit's commander just received word about the story. They're ordering a full elimination protocol. All targets, all witnesses." "Understood," Miller replied calmly. "Initiate Phase 3. Across the city, Carson's carefully planned distractions evolved from simple explosions into something more complex. Underground electrical lines failed in precise patterns, trapping Shadow Unit vehicles between disabled traffic signals. Water mains burst strategically, cutting off direct routes through the city. And in seemingly random locations, caches of documents began appearing, physical evidence supporting every claim in Sarah's story. Shadow Unit's commander, watching his carefully planned operation disintegrate, made the call they'd been waiting for. "Execute primary target immediately. Full tactical response authorized." Their remaining observation teams converged on the garage, moving with lethal purpose. They found precisely what they expected: a heavily guarded convoy preparing to transfer Cross, exactly where their intelligence said it would be. The firefight was brief, but intense. Shadow Unit's operators were among the best in the world, and they executed their assault perfectly. Within minutes, they'd neutralized the apparent security detail and reached the armored transport vehicle. But when they breached the vehicle, they found only a sophisticated dummy rigged with sensors, and a single phone displaying Sarah's story, already going viral across the globe. "Ghost 1. Sarah's voice was tense in Miller's ear. "Rivera. Reports the package is secure. Real transfer completed 20 minutes ago. But we have a problem. Shadow Unit's commander, he's not following the script." Miller, watching from his hidden position, saw it too. Instead of falling back to regroup, Shadow Unit's teams were spreading out through the city with deadly purpose. Their commander had decided that if he couldn't stop the story, he'd eliminate everyone connected to it. "They're heading for the safe house," Wilson reported urgently. "And the command center. Multiple teams, heavy weapons. They're not trying to be subtle anymore." Miller's voice remained calm. "Exactly as expected. Sarah, initiate Omega Protocol." In the command center, Sarah opened a final set of files. Deadman switches Miller had prepared years ago. If Shadow Unit wanted to play hardball, they were about to learn why the ghosts had remained uncatchable for 15 years. Across the city, Evidence began appearing in the offices of every major law enforcement agency. Files detailing Shadow Unit's illegal operations, their assassination programs, their connections to corrupt officials. 15 years of accumulated dirt, gathered by ghosts who'd learned to hide in plain sight. But Shadow Unit's commander wasn't backing down. His teams had nearly reached the command center, prepared to eliminate everyone inside. Sarah, James. "Get out of there," Miller ordered. "Emergency extraction protocol." "Negative," Sarah replied calmly. "We're staying. Trust me." Miller started to argue, but then he saw it. Shadow Unit's teams were approaching the command center exactly as I predicted, following their standard breach protocols. They'd been so focused on their targets, they'd forgotten the first rule of hunting ghosts. Sometimes the trap isn't where you think it is. Carson's voice came over the comm, heavy with satisfaction. "Package is primed. On your go, Sarah." Shadow Unit's teams breached the command center's doors with textbook precision and found themselves in a killing box of their own making. Hidden defenses activated, corridors locked down, and their own tactics were turned against them. "Like I said," Sarah's voice was steel wrapped in silk, "we knew you were coming. Did you really think we'd be here?" The real command center was elsewhere. The building Shadow Unit had assaulted nothing but an elaborate trap, and now their teams were scattered across the city, their communications compromised, and their classified operations exposed to the world. Miller keyed his radio. "Shadow Unit Actual, this is Ghost 1. Perhaps we should talk." There was a long pause before Shadow Unit's commander responded. "You're done. You know that, right? Even if we can't stop the story now, we'll hunt you forever. There's no going. Back to the shadows after this." "Who said anything about going back?" Miller replied. "Check your secure channel, the one you think we don't know about." A moment later, he heard the commander curse. On that channel, he'd find live feeds showing his own superiors being arrested by FBI agents led by Rivera. The evidence Ghost Team had accumulated hadn't just exposed Shadow Unit. It had revealed the entire corrupt network that had protected them. "It's over," Miller continued. "The story's out. The prototype is secured. Cross is in custody and talking. Your organization is exposed. You have two choices: surrender to Rivera's team or become ghosts yourselves. But ask yourself, do you really have what it takes to disappear?" Thunder cracked overhead as rain began to fall. Throughout Mason Creek, Shadow Unit's teams found themselves confronted with a simple choice: give up or run. Most chose to surrender. A few tried to fight. None escaped. In a hidden bunker beneath the city, Sarah watched it all unfold on her monitors. Beside her, James squeezed her shoulder with pride. They'd done it. The truth was out. Justice was being served. And the ghosts. "What happens now?" she asked over the comm. Miller's voice came back thoughtful. Now we do what we've always done. There are other cities, other battles. Just because this story's being told doesn't mean we stop watching, stop protecting. But you don't have to hide anymore, Sarah pointed out. Don't we? There was a smile in Miller's voice. Sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight. The world knows about Dubai now, about Cross, about what we've been doing. But they don't know everything. There are always more shadows, more threats, and more ghosts to face them, James added. Sarah looked at her monitors, where her story was spreading across the globe. Comments and reactions were pouring in, people finally learning about the quiet heroes who'd protected them for so long. But even as she watched, she knew Miller was right. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. "So," she said, "when do we start?" The storm broke over Mason Creek, rain washing away the traces of battle. In the federal building's garage, Miller finally stepped out of his hidden position. Shadow Unit's teams were being taken into custody, their weapons confiscated, their organization in ruins. Cross was already on his way to a secure facility, accompanied by Rivera and a team she personally vetted. The prototype would be destroyed, its designs buried so deep that no one could ever recreate its terrible potential. The families from Dubai would finally be able to live openly, their sacrifices acknowledged at last. But even as this chapter closed, Miller knew others were opening. Across the country, other ghosts would be watching, waiting, protecting. The world might know about them now, but that didn't change their mission. If anything, it made it more important. Sarah's voice came over his comm one last time. Ghost. 1. Headquarters is secure. Shadow unit is neutralized. Standing by for new orders. Miller looked out over the city he'd protected for 15 years. Lightning illuminated the streets where he'd played at being a simple retiree, the bus route, where he'd first revealed himself, the tower where a 15-year mission had finally ended. New orders are simple, he replied. We keep watching, we keep protecting, and we remember why we became ghosts in the first place. To fight the battles others can't see, Sarah finished. Exactly. Miller smiled as thunder rolled overhead. Welcome to the team, Ghost 7. In the years that followed, Mason Creek would sometimes whisper about the night the ghost came out of the shadows. They'd talk about the mysterious explosions, the exposed conspiracy, the truth about Dubai. Some would even claim to have seen the old man who started it all, still riding the bus routes, still watching, still protecting. But the real story, the story of what happened after, of battles fought in other cities, of threats stopped before they could begin, that story remained untold, because some ghosts prefer to remain in the shadows, visible only in the moments when justice demands they step into the light. And in those shadows, they continue their watch, these quiet guardians who chose to become ghosts so others could live in the light. Different cities, different battles, but always the same mission, to protect, to serve, to stand against the darkness. For in the end, that's what ghosts do best. They haunt the places where evil thinks itself safe, bringing justice to those who believe themselves beyond its reach. And if you look carefully, in the quiet moments between the storms, you might just catch a glimpse of them, the ghosts who choose to protect us all. Did you enjoy uncovering the truth behind the ghost of Mason Creek? Hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more stories about the heroes who fight our battles from the shadows. Until next time, keep watching the shadows. You never know who might be watching back.